extending Angular with ngxtension. Quick introduction. I'm Enea Jahollari. I'm a GTE for Angular. I'm a software engineer at Pushbase.io, where we work with performance, architectures, design system, accessibility, and other cool stuff. Open source, of course. So I'd like to start this with one question. Do you have a utils folder or utils file in your code base? Yes or no? I believe probably the answer is yes. And of course, me too, I have one. And today it looks something like this. And we'll see why. Well, ngxtension started with one utility that we wanted to reuse in different projects, and that we is me and Chao Tran, another GDE and a cool open source contributor. And we were talking about computedPrevious, a utility. And of course, I also have a backstory of the computedPrevious utility, where it's written in the justangular.com blog post, where we discussed, let's say, different ideas on what's the best way to go forward with trade-offs and stuff like that. Of course, we had the connect method, which was being discussed, so we were just prototyping it. And Chao also had the create injection token, which today is used inside ngxtension, but also in a lot of projects to easily create injection tokens, let's say with a nicer API. Well, this is where the name came from. Basically, we're searching for something that has to do with utils or extension. And then we had ngxtension, which, let's say, it was not taken in NPM. So we went with it. Oh, and the date, 9 September of 2023. So ngxtension. We were thinking, hey, we want a library that has a lot of utilities, but what about the bundle size? So if everyone installs this, they probably, if they use stuff, they probably will get every single, let's say, utility on their production builds. But we didn't want that behavior. So that's why we went with secondary entry points. That's a feature that is available on Angular for a lot of time now, but it's unexplored from what I've seen. So I also wanted to, let's say, give a shout out to secondary entry points. That's how material works, material prime ng, I guess, or ng Zoro or Spartan UI and stuff like that. Basically, it allows you to have minimal chunks of, let's say, JavaScript instead of having one big chunk of JavaScript that your bundler have to tree shake. And of course, ngxtension uses that heavily for each utility. So each utility is its own secondary entry point that you have to, let's say, use, and you have to import directly from the entry point instead of from ngxtension directly. So ngxtension is, let's say, made of a couple of things like signal utilities, injector utilities, RxJS operators, migrations, and some other cool stuff that I don't know how to name or categorize. So signal utilities. First, derivedAsync. DerivedAsync was, let's say, a solution that served as well. Basically, what you can do is you can just provide, let's say, an observable or a promise, read a signal inside of it, and it will act as a computed, but with some cool behavior that it will cancel by default the observable when that signal inside changes. So this made it great for, let's say, not having unsubscribed observables on your code. So in this case, the movie would change every time the movie ID input changed. And this makes it great when you want to, let's say, have a reactive state on your component. Of course, you could provide an initial value. But one cool thing was that you can also provide a behavior. And this would basically just swap the operators under the hood. So by default, we use, let's say, the switch map, which will just cancel the previous one, but you could also provide concat, merge, or exhaust, which of course will use concat map, merge map, or exhaust map under the hood. But it was string based, so later, if the browser supports observables natively, maybe we don't have to use RxJS directly anymore, but just go with browser native APIs. I don't know. Let's hope. But with the new Rx resource API, we could just get that same behavior. So instead of having, let's say, just a return function, we can have a request where we pass the movie ID and the loader, which gets that movie ID and, of course, subscribes to it, basically listens to it, and, of course, get the movie ID and get the movie based on that ID, sorry. There's derived from. That's next. Derived from was basically combined latest, but with signal support. So while doing migration work from observables to signals, I had this issue of having multiple, let's say, items on my components and stores as signals, multiple as observables because they weren't migrated yet, and I had a lot of combined latest. So that's where derived from was born. Basically, it was made to just combine. So you can pass an array to it, and it will just give that value as a signal. And that was really good, and it still is. And of course, derived from accepts an array as the first parameter, which can include signals or observables. And the second, let's say, param is a pipe, or basically you can pass observables or RxJS operators. So you can have page, user ID, and filters, and you can pass switch map there. So you get that good behavior of canceling the previous API call. And of course, you don't have to subscribe to it because we're using signals and we want things to be, have a nice API to use. And of course, we can use start with to give that an initial value. Or we can just provide that as the third parameter of that function, and we can say initial value there. Then there is the connect method. The connect method is great when you have a signal, but you want that signal to depend on some observable state or observable value. For this, you might say, hey, but we want to use, for example, toSignal. But that toSignal, let's say, function basically will subscribe to observable and give you the value, but now you cannot write to it anymore. So you need to store that to another signal or connect that to another signal. And that's what the connect function basically does. Here we have, for example, page number, which is a signal. And we have the page number, which also comes from some data service or data store. And what we can do inside the constructor, we can say page number should be connected to the page number from the data service. So every time page number observable changes, please update my page number. But at the same time, we can update the page number locally here on this component. So we won't propagate that state up to the service anymore. So this was some use case that was really not easy to do before, but now with Connect, it was, let's say, straightforward. You can just connect a signal to an observable. And what this really does is just subscribes to an observable that you pass, and of course, just set a signal that you pass there. And of course, unsubscribe from the observable when the component is destroyed. There were also the case where you could also connect a signal to another signal. So this is how I was, let's say, having that linked signal behavior before linked signal itself. Basically, I'm connecting page number to the page number that was coming from data service. And for this, what's happening under the hood is that this callback function is put it inside an effect. And that effect, every time it runs, just updates the signal state here. And of course, have that same behavior as before. So same as observables or also with signals. But it's better to use linked signal today. So that's two APIs inside ngxtension that, let's say, fulfill their job, because now Angular provides its official tools to, let's say, solve these problems. Of course, Connect also supports having, let's say, let's say, kind of reducer state or reducer function, so you can get the previous value and do some really cool things with it. I won't go into much details. Everything is clearly explained on the docs. Yeah, one last thing, Connect is heavily inspired by the RxState connect method that is inside the Rx Angular package. explicitEffect. Well, there are cases where we want to read some signals, and based on those signals, we want to run some side effects. So having count and state, and then we want to untrack everything else because we don't want, let's say, that callback function to, let's say, be tracked or read any other signals that may cause, side effects inside our main effect. And for this, we created explicitEffect. Basically, you pass, let's say, an array as the first parameter where you pass the signals. And the second one will be a callback function that gives you those signal values. So basically, now the effect here will only run where count and state will run, and you don't have to use untracked. So that's basically what this thing does under the hood for you. And of course, this feels a little bit like React, right? It's not. Well, computedPrevious. computedPrevious is great when you want to have that previous value of a signal. So if we have A and B, and we want, let's say, B to always be dependent on A, this is what we can do. So if we just console log B, we will get null. And if we set A, and then we console log B again, we will get the last previous value of A, which would be 1. And of course, if we change A again, we will get, we console log B, we will get 2. So this is great when you care about the previous state of a signal, like to do some, I don't know, rollback function or stuff like that. createNotifier. createNotifier is great when you need to trigger an effect and you want a good name or a good API. And for example, what I have here is a basic thing. So if we have an effect and we want to trigger that effect, you'll have to have a signal inside of it that you'll have to change. And for this, we created a createNotifier, which basically creates a signal under the hood and gives you 2 methods. The first one is listen, and the listen will just call a signal. And because it's inside an effect, will be registered. And of course, if you want to trigger now that effect, we have this notify method, which just increases that signal by 1. And we have the listen that is being listened here that triggers the effect. So it's basically just a signal increase that triggers an effect, but with a cooler API and easy to use, because now you know, or you better understand, where are you listening and where are you notifying this effect from. Well, there's also a lot of injector utilities like injectLazy, params, queryParams that will go a little bit more in details now. So injectLazy basically allows you to use inject, but with, let's say, lazy import or a dynamic import. So here we have const data service import, which is a arrow function that is returning a dynamic import to our service or data service. So if we want to inject this now, we cannot just use inject because we cannot inject dynamic imports. We have to inject classes. But with injectLazy, that's what we do under the hood. Basically, we can pass a dynamic import to injectLazy, and it will await the promise and inject that service, and of course, give that to us as an observable. So here we have private data service. So data service is basically our service, but as an observable. And what we can do is we can just say, I want to lazy load my service first, and then I want to get the data. So this is useful on cases where you don't want your service to be part of your, let's say, JavaScript bundle, but you really want that to be completely lazy. And that's how we can do it. There are cases where you move some service to pre-provided in a root and you just provide them as a component and you lazy load the component. But if you want to go into more lazy loaded fields, then this is just the next step of lazy loading. So you can just lazy load the service. injectParams. injectParams is basically just hooking into the router and grabbing activated route under the hood, subscribing to the params observable. And of course, it gives you the, let's say, the param that you're asking it for. In our case, it's ID. So what this will do is we'll go to the activated route and grab that ID from there. And every time it changes, user ID will change. And as a signal, we can use it with derivedFrom and get some user using that user ID. So it's two ngxtension APIs which play nicely together to show some state. This now, of course, can be replaced with Rx resource. But it was nice having both of those before Rx resource. And of course, there's a blog post that explains injectParams function. There's also injectRouteData, which does the same thing. Basically, goes to the activated route, asks the data, and grabs the key that you passed to it. And of course, it's reactive. So every time it changes, the details signal now will also be updated. So you don't have to subscribe to activated route data, get the value, set it to a signal. You just say inject route data, pass the key, and that's it. You get those things out of the box. injectQueryParams also does the same thing as before. Instead of grabbing the param, it grabs the query params. So in my case, we have search here, and of course, search param, and every time it changes, it gives us that value. Of course, derivedAsync, we can say get users based on that search param or with an initial value of an empty array. So we can filter users and have that search param from there. So all these APIs are connected together with, let's say, with signals and effects under the hood. So everything that's being listened is also destroyed when the component gets destroyed. So there's probably not going to be any memory leaks. injectNetwork. If you ever cared about the network of your users, for example, if they are offline or online or what kind of speed, or if it's 3G, 4G, then injectNetwork function will just give you that state as a signal, of course. And you can just use that directly inside an effect, inside your template, and it will be a nice touch to your application, I guess. For example, disable every interaction if the user is offline, so they don't have to click buttons that don't work. RxJS Operators. Well, the first one is debug. Debug, basically, you can hook it inside a pipe operator and then do something like before and after. And it's good for debugging. It will give you the timestamp and the values before, of course, and after. So basically, everywhere you put it, it will just console log the value. There is mapArray. This is in cases where you have to do something like you have a source, which is an array, and then you have, let's say, map. You have to map it. And then because map is a RxJS operator, you have to map that array again using just normal array mapping. And that's sometimes not easy to grasp. So that's why we also just created this mapArray. So if we know that we're getting an array, we can just map that array directly. Okay, so one other thing is poll. And what poll does is basically it calls the observable again every X seconds, and after X seconds that you provide. In this case, we will grab or we will make a get call to the data, to the API every 10 seconds after the first 5 seconds. So you can just poll APIs with this in order to just get some data refreshed. And the other cool one, which I use together with poll sometimes, is whenDocumentVisible. So if you're on a website and then you have, let's say, a polling happening, but you move to another tab, you don't want to, let's say, continue to poll that API anymore. So that's where we do whenDocumentVisible, which basically listen to the tab, see if you're on the current tab, then okay, continue polling. Otherwise, just stop it for the moment. And those two things are really good when used together. Code migrations. Code migrations basically were one of the coolest thing of ngxtension, I have to say. I'll just showcase this input one. So basically you could run the convert signal inputs, and what it would do is just convert that input to a signal input. And of course, go update the template, goes update to the also the code that we're using it. There's also output. And it will do the same thing. It goes from decorator-based APIs to signal-based, or in this case, output is not signal-based, but to the modern APIs. And of course, take care of types, and of course, also the usages. Inject, I think, was the first one that we shipped. So it took care of a lot of cases where even if you had, let's say, injection tokens or multiple decorators like self and optional, all those things were also easily migratable using ngxtension inject migration. But those things will be deprecated soon because Angular now on v19 ships code migrations for everything that I've listed here. So if you go, if you're in Angular v19 and do ngg Angular core ng update, it will list you all the cool new migration schematics that can easily migrate your code base to the latest features. And so you can really benefit from those things. So you can do control flow migration, inject migration, route lazy loading, signal input, signal queries, and of course, standalone migration that was there before. Okay, some other utilities. clickOutside of resize and createEffect. Well, clickOutside just like the name says, basically it's a directive that you apply on an element, but you listen to it as an output of that element. And of course, it will emit every time that you click outside it, in this case, div. And for example, if you're in some kind of tooltip that is completely custom made, clickOutside is a really good directive for that. Then there is createEffect, which is a RxJS-based event handler with pure developer experience. So in this case here, what we have is we're creating an effect that basically just maps the value times 2, and so basically doubles it, and we can tap. And we can call that function, and we can pass to it an observable. So it will start the effect, and every time the interval emits, the log will be called, and this thing here will happen. So basically what this is it's same as you're creating a subject, subscribing to it, but also you'll also have to unsubscribe for it. But but all those things are handled behind the scenes. createEffect, I think, was copied from component store. So createEffect is just a copy of component store, but with some other nice touches. So createEffect is great when you, for example, have to do some, API call, you want to debounce it, but instead of having like a subject that you subscribe to get the value, you just say createEffect, and you can pass that string, basically like a search query. You can debounce it, distinct, and switch map, and return that value. Sorry, that observable. And inside of it, we're using tap. We can set a signal. And of course, it's always good to catch errors. And in order to use search users, in this case, would be just set that search query signal or normal value. And in ng model change, you can also just search for users, and this will apply all the debouncing and distinct until changed. And of course, canceling the previous API request. So createEffect basically subscribes for you and unsubscribes for you, but you can call it as a function. So you don't have to recreate all that logic all over again on your code base. Good job, component store. Thank you for creating it. Okay, so this is another example. Like, of course, you can always have some loading state or some error handling different from the previous one. So one cool thing about the createEffect version in ngxtension is that you can, of course, you can call it with an observable. So you can pass an observable to it, and we subscribe to that observable. You can pass normal values. For example, page ID here is a signal, but we have called it. So when we pass to the value to the load page details, we pass a normal one. But we can also just pass page ID as a signal. And what we will do is we will also listen to that signal. And every time it changes, we will just go over the switch map again and everything else. So we can support observables, normal values, but also signals. And everything will just work. Yes, createEffect is my favorite API ever. It's used all over some of my code bases. So yeah, it's cool. Well, there's also new stuff coming, and that is linkedQueryParam. I have shared it a couple of days ago on Twitter and Blue Sky. So linkedQueryParam idea is to have two-way binding with queryParams. So before I showcased you injectQueryParams, that basically is just a signal that every time queryParams changes, you get that value. But linkedQueryParam is a writable signal, meaning that you can get the search query param, but you can also set the search query param. I'll show you in a bit. So we have support for, of course, strings. So this will produce a writable signal, which is a string or null. Or you can also put a parse function. We also provide this param to number helper function that will parse the page query param, convert it to a number. And if it doesn't exist, you can also provide a default one. Of course, I've used this with RxResource to showcase it. Like we can have search, status, or page, and every time one of those things changes, you just want to get the to-dos. So all these APIs play nicely together. And this is how linkedQueryParam is being used. Because this is a writable signal, we can just use that in the same place as other values. So we can use this with ngModel. ngModel two-way data binding directly connected to the router queryParams. So we have two-way data binding everywhere. And of course, if we're searching for something, we also want most of the time to set the page to the first one. So you don't search on page number 10. And of course, we can do that here. And the page, of course, is a linkedQueryParam, but we can also change page in another input. So we can use that in a couple of places. So we can have set or update. And the beauty of this is that when you search, only one navigation will happen, because this thing will be scheduled using an effect, which probably will be a set timeout under the hood. So no matter how many times you, let's say, update the query params synchronously, so you can change 5 query params synchronously, only one navigation will happen. In my case here, I have update on submit. So we have search changes that will be applied on the query param only when you press enter or when you submit the form. Yeah, this is from Rx resource, where we can have now to do this loading, error, and of course get the value, all reactively. Here's the Stack Blitz link that you can play with. I'll share also the presentation after the talk. And yeah, this is mostly some of the APIs that we support. So you can have show hidden. So basically you can work with Booleans on the query params. Count, you can work with numbers. So you can provide your own functions. So parsing and stringifying. Filtering, you can pass a whole object there as a string. It's not recommended, but hey, you can do it. And of course, stringify. So this will be something like when we work with local storage, where we do before storing stringify, and after we get something, we parse it. Imagine doing that now with the query params, and because query params can be shared, you can pass state to everyone. Of course, you can also just store arrays there by just splitting and joining them based on parse and stringify. These are all being tested. So, and of course, probably will be released soon. Yes. Last thing is everything is heavily tested. So every utility that is inside ngxtension is being tested heavily. We have a lot of test cases. And I have to say that most of the time when I have some code that I have to test, that I use maybe some signal or some observable, I go to ngxtension repository, open the tests to understand, okay, what's the best way to test this kind of, let's say, timing, or to test this kind of feature, because there's a lot of testing patterns that we have used inside the ngxtension that maybe they may be useful to you too. And of course, every time we break something, we haven't lately, we always migrate using the schematics. So everything is basically your code base will be safe from breaking changes. But you should always read the change logs if there's a new major to see if there's migrations and how to run them. Yes, this is all made possible by this lovely community of developers that contribute their time and knowledge to produce the best tools out there for everyone to use. And of course, ngxtension is also heavily used. There's currently 31 weekly downloads, and as we can see, is increasing every day. I want to say thanks to NX for the cloud support. So every time that we have this, let's say, CI runs, everything is cached, it's fast. Of course, we have direct support from Chao, who works at NX. That's why everything is really good connected and supported. It was extending Angular with ngxtension. I'm Enea Jahollari, and thank you for watching.
Thank you, Enea, for the presentation. It was great, and now let's dive into our Q&A session. So please ask your questions in the chat, and we'll start with the first one. First, another words of appreciation, great content. And there is a question, maybe not really related to ngxtension, but somehow any ideas of how to work with signal service in a reusable component and the data do not interfere to the other one, like maintaining multiple instances of reusable components on the same page?
Yeah, how I've solved this is the service probably would have to be provided only at the component level. So you put the service not provided in root, but you just provide it directly in the component providers. So now you'll have a service for each component, a service instance for each component. And if you need global state, then you probably will have to use some global state management service or store, I don't know, Signal Store or RxAngular or who else is using signals these days?
Okay, nice.
But yeah,
Thank
that would
you.
be my solution.
Yeah,
And I'm
sounds
doing
like a
that a
plan.
lot. Yeah.
Yeah. And then we have another one about using injectQueryParams. If using search param on the template keeps calling the method on every Angular change detection run.
Search param is a signal, and signals are, let's say, memoized under the hood. So basically, it doesn't call any kind of method. It's just returning you the latest value. So if it did change, it will give you the latest value. If it didn't, it will just return the last one. So it's just think of it as using a computed. It's highly performant, so there's no issue of calling it. So now it won't subscribe on every change detection.
Yeah, that's
it's
right.
Safe.
And yeah, and then we have another one not related to ngxtension again, but people seem to want to hear from you some advices about the career in Angular. Where should they start, or what things should they know to become good in Angular?
Start from the docs, I'd say, and they are a really good path. And of course, just start to build something. That's the best way to learn. Try to think of an idea, and you should be good just by building it and learning what to use for that.
Nice.
Give me a second.
Then another one. No worries. Okay, in the meantime, you could maybe share if you are using ng extensions in your project. We are really curious to know. And I believe this information will be also helpful to Enea and the whole ng extension team. Okay, seems the Enea is back, but still post your comments to the chat. And we have another question about the lazy inject. If it creates a new instance of the service each time or uses singleton instance from the providers?
It will use injector.get under the hood, so it won't create a new instance. So basically, it's just like using inject, but you can pass a dynamic import with.
Okay.
And of course, it returns an observable. That's the only difference.
Okay, and then we have 3 quite funny questions. Let's start with this one. Are we going to have ng Tirana next year?
If Mario is up for it, I am also up for it. So let's do it.
That would be great. This one might be a little bit controversial, but
is Chao better coder than
yourself?
Totally. I mean, if you want to check out the private chats, I'm always asking Chao, hey, I don't know how to do this. Please help me. I'm not showing it now, but that's how it works.
Yeah. And one more thing, like some folks from the Angular Love noticed you have quite interesting
I mean, these guys.
Yeah.
Well, it's from House of Angular.
Yeah, that's great. Everything tastes better with Angular, right?
Mm-hmm. Also keeping notes.
Oh, yeah, so like a full set.
Yes.
That's great. Okay, so Enea, thank you very much for being here today with us. Thank you for your time, for your answer during the Q&A session, and hopefully we can see each other pretty soon. Until then, take care.
Thank you.